I never imagined I would find a letter that would change everything while cleaning my childhood room. My name is Emily, and up until that moment, I thought I perfectly understood my role and place in my family. I was the responsible one, the reliable one. I believed my purpose was to support my stepsister, Sandy, from the shadows while she pursued her dreams. Emily, don't forget to check the back of the closet. I heard my stepmother's voice from downstairs. She spoke with that typical mix of sweetness and authority. If you find anything from your old school, maybe we can donate it. With a sigh, I pushed another box towards the door. I didn't need reminders to do a deep clean. I hadn't needed them for years. But that was my stepmother's nature. Always giving instructions and seeking to maintain control over everything, even now as we prepared to move to a smaller house. As I organized the almost empty closet, my fingers brushed against something hidden behind the baseboard. At the back of the closet, there was a slightly yellowed envelope worn by time. I recognized it immediately. It had my name written in my late father's elegant handwriting. I took out the letter and carefully opened the seal with my hands. I trembled as I took great care not to tear the old paper. As soon as I saw the date at the top, my heart began to race. The letter had been written just a few weeks before my dad passed away. To my beloved daughter Emily, if you are reading this letter, it means my wish has not been fulfilled. I asked your stepmother to give you the college fund I have prepared for you, a total of 50,000 pesos. That money is intended solely for you, to help you pursue your dreams. It pained me to see how your stepmother favored Sandy, dimming your light in the process. I hope this money helps you recover that brilliance. As I read, tears fell and the words began to blur. A college fund? My stepmother had always said that we didn't have enough money for both of us to go to college. They told me I had to work to support Sandy's education, and I accepted it as my role in the family, something that at the time seemed natural. But hidden within that role was a secret I had no idea about. My dad and my stepmother had married 5 years ago. My dad, who had raised me alone, told me he wanted to remarry, and I was genuinely happy. I was excited to have a stepsister and a new mom. However, that feeling didn't last long. My stepmother only cared about Sandy. The reason was simple. I wasn't her biological daughter. My dad understood this too, and he used to argue with her about it. Every time they fought, he would apologize to me and take me to places I wanted to visit. He even seemed to be considering divorce. But a year ago, he passed away in an accident, leaving my biological mother, already deceased, behind a long time ago. I basically became an orphan. That's when my life really became a nightmare. Let me go back to the story. While I was in a state of shock after reading the letter, I heard my stepmother's voice. Emily. Her voice sounded closer this time, probably wondering why I was taking so long to come downstairs. I quickly folded the letter and put it in my pocket. My heart was pounding when I heard her footsteps approaching. For the last year, my stepmother had concealed the existence of this letter. While my stepsister attended the school of her dreams, I, on the other hand, worked as a waitress in a restaurant and also took cleaning jobs. Despite seeing me striving so hard, my stepmother never said a single word about the college fund. Yes, I'm here, I shouted with a calmer voice than I expected. When my stepmother entered the room, I pretended to be reviewing some old documents. My hand remained firm on the letter in my pocket. My dad had tried to secure a future for me, but my stepmother had stolen it from me. The person standing in front of her was no longer the same as before. I, the quiet and obedient daughter, had learned the truth. I was becoming someone completely different, someone who sought answers, maybe even revenge. I slowly looked at my childhood bedroom for the last time. Nothing could remain the same. I had been blind to the truth hidden in this room from the beginning. But now that I had found it, there was no turning back. I waited until dinner to bring out the letter. When I placed it on the kitchen table, my palms were damp with sweat. My stepmother, like every night, was carefully arranging the placemats. Meanwhile, my stepsister Sandy was probably texting her college friends while I cleaned the dishes. Today I found something interesting. I began striving to keep my voice steady. A letter from my dad. My stepmother's hands stopped dead. A deafening silence filled the air. She didn't turn around, but I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. It's just a letter, I said, but it talks about a college fund. I pushed the letter forward. He left 50,000 pesos for me. At those words, Sandy looked up in surprise, and her hand stopped typing on her phone. Oh, my dear Emily, my stepmother began in a calm and condescending voice. Your father was a bit confused before he died. He made many promises, but perhaps he forgot the date of this letter. I interrupted her. It was written just 2 weeks before he died, and it clearly states that the money had already been set aside. I refused to back down. Do you really believe that? Sandy's voice was cold as she stared at me wide-eyed. Seriously, you think your dad left you a secret fortune? Maybe he left you a yacht too. My stepmother cleared her throat. Your father and I did the best we could for this family. You understand how expensive college can be, right? Sandy had potential, and it was necessary to support her future. I couldn't contain myself any longer at those words. I stood up abruptly, and the sound of the chair scraping against the floor echoed in the room. And what about my potential? I said, my voice breaking. I've been working nonstop at that restaurant and as a cleaner. I've been giving half my salary for this house while Sandy pursues her dreams. Stop being so dramatic, my stepmother finally yelled, her voice raised and full of anger. We've all made sacrifices. Sandy needed things that were absolutely essential. I didn't understand anything she was saying. Meanwhile, Sandy gave a sarcastic smile, but it seemed slightly forced. It's not my fault you didn't do well in school. Someone in this family had to grow up and be successful. The casual cruelty in her words pierced my chest, leaving me breathless. I looked at my stepmother, clinging to a sliver of hope that she would recognize the injustice and defend me, but she remained silent, pretending nothing had happened. At that moment, a phrase my dad used to say resonated in my mind. Focus on the present. What's done is done. I silently picked up the letter, letting those words from my dad sink deep into my heart. They had stolen my future, and now they were trying to erase any trace of its existence. I could see it clearly. They were returning to their usual roles. Sandy, the golden child of the family, and my stepmother, the enthusiastic audience to her success story. As I watched them, something inside me began to change. Something hardened, becoming resolute and unyielding. You're right, Dad, I said quietly. What's done is done. But what happens next is up to me. The trip to my Aunt Jody's house after that confrontation with my family felt like an escape from reality. I could no longer endure another minute of my stepmother's cold silence or Sandy's smug attitude. When I arrived at Jody's cabin, the garden was overgrown, and a wind chime swayed gently in the breeze. This place felt different, like a breath of fresh air, like a refuge. I had always felt this house was a safe haven for me. Upon opening the front door, the sweet aroma of cookies baking in the kitchen greeted me. You found the letter, didn't you? Jody said as she looked at me, wiping her hands on her floral apron. Her tone was full of certainty. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded silently. My voice felt trapped in my throat. Come sit down, dear. There's more you need to know. Jody pulled out a chair and gently urged me to sit. Then she disappeared into her study and returned a few minutes later, holding an old envelope. She placed it on the table in front of me. Your father left more than just the college fund. Here are bank statements, letters to trustees, and even recordings of conversations with your stepmother. Everything is here. As I pulled out the documents and began to look them over, my hand began to tremble. The bank statements showed regular deposits made over the years that far exceeded the 50,000 pesos they had told me was for the fund. At that moment I realized how meticulously my father had planned everything, and how much my stepmother had hidden. The documents revealed that 3 months after my dad's death, all the funds were transferred to a new account and used to pay for Sandy's college tuition. He knew she might do something like this, Jody said, her voice raised with anger. That's why he made me promise I'd keep copies of everything. Overwhelmed with confusion and fury, I asked, why didn't you tell me before? Jody sighed deeply and replied, your father told me to wait until you found the letter on your own. He believed you needed to be ready to stand on your own 2 feet first. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car door closing outside. Through the open window, Jody and I could hear my stepmother's voice. She was talking to a neighbor, and she was saying she had something to discuss with me. Jody squeezed my hand tightly. If you're not ready, you don't have to face her, she said softly. But I was already picking up the documents and organizing them. My heart was pounding, but I felt a strange sense of calm. In fact, it seemed like this was the perfect moment. I heard my stepmother's footsteps climbing the front steps, followed by Sandy's exaggerated sigh. Emily, my stepmother called as she entered the room. But when she saw the documents spread out on the table, she froze. Her face turned pale. Is this what you were looking for? I asked, holding up a bank statement. The records clearly showed the exact amounts withdrawn to pay for Sandy's college tuition. This was my college fund. You had no right to touch it. Sandy opened her mouth to argue, but Jody interrupted her. It was her money. You stole it. My stepmother avoided my gaze and shifted her eyes, murmuring in a low voice, I was thinking of paying it back, returning it with my paycheck after I finished paying for Sandy's master's degree. I rose from my chair, anger surging through me in a way I hadn't felt in years. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I watched as the wall of lies my stepmother had so carefully constructed began to crumble. In that moment I realized something. What my father had left me wasn't just money. He had left me the truth. And with the truth, the power to free myself. Finally, the fluorescent lights of the diner made everything look cold and lifeless. During my night shift, I poured coffee into mugs mechanically, feeling a strange sense of detachment from reality. Emily, are you okay? You look like you're about to faint, a coworker asked, preparing another order beside me with concern. I'm fine, I replied, though I wasn't so sure. Although my gaze was fixed on a figure visible through the diner's door. At that moment, the bell above the door chimed. Sandy walked in. She was wearing a designer coat she had proudly received as a Christmas gift from my stepmother. Seeing her made my stomach clench. Sandy slid onto a stool at the counter and looked directly at me. I need to talk to you, she said, her tone irritated. You've upset Mom, she added. I remained silent and continued wiping the counter. I didn't look at her. I'm working anyway, I replied without turning around. Sandy continued in a low voice. Mom isn't working and the mortgage on the house is overdue. Is this what you wanted? With those words, I finally stopped and looked at Sandy. What are you talking about? I asked, surprised. My voice, surprisingly calm, cut through the diner's noise. Mom took out a second mortgage to pay for my last semester, Sandy said, leaning closer to me. She was counting on the income from her rental payments to cover it. At that moment, my mind went blank. The coffee pot in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor, the scalding liquid splashing my ankles, but I barely registered the pain. All those shifts, all those extra hours, the money I had sweated and worked so hard to earn had disappeared once again into Sandy's education. Not once but twice. Emily, take 5. Doris, my coworker, said, appearing with a mop and starting to clean. She spoke gently and I nodded, heading for the break room, leaning against the wall. I opened my banking app with trembling hands. There it was, the record of the money I had been depositing into my parents' account for the past 5 years. It was supposed to be for my education, for my future. But that too had been used for Sandy. The door opened silently, and I turned to see Sandy standing there. She didn't look apologetic. Instead, her voice sounded irritated when she said, I get that you're upset about Dad's money, but stop. I turned to look at her, whispering with all my strength, I can't stop. Sandy sighed and continued, looking me straight in the eye. Mom did it for me because I have potential. You don't. At that moment, the silent anger I had carried inside ignited completely. Is that so? Or did you just decide that before giving me a chance? My whispers were hardening into something much more resolute. That's unfair, I said quietly. Stealing my future is more than unfair. I untied my apron and told Doris I would be taking the rest of my shift off. Emily, wait. Sandy called after me, but I didn't turn around. My mind was racing, and I started mentally calculating the money I'd stashed away in a separate account. It wasn't much, but it was probably enough to cover expenses for a year. It would be enough for a down payment on a small apartment. I trusted that Aunt Jody would help me figure out the rest. Just then my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from my stepmother. Tonight we have family dinner. We need to discuss your attitude. I stared at the message for a moment and then replied curtly, There's nothing to discuss. I'm leaving. I've consulted a lawyer, and you will be held accountable for using my inheritance. Then I blocked both their numbers. I started the car and drove toward Aunt Jody's house. For the first time, the weight of the lies and control that had been imposed on me for so many years seemed to finally lift. In its place, a vibrant, heart-wrenching hope began to rise. I realized revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. I sat on Aunt Jody's bed in the guest room, looking at apartment listings on my phone. My vision was a bit blurry when I realized that this was the first step toward a new life. Surrounded by hastily packed boxes, I had already rented a small studio apartment downtown. It wasn't big, but it was affordable with my waitress salary. And that was enough to start having my freedom. Just as I was about to call the landlord to confirm my move-in date, a loud, persistent knocking sounded at the door, making me jump. "Emily, I know you're in there." My stepmother's voice was sharp and desperate. Aunt Jody appeared at the door, her expression serious. "You don't have to talk to her," she told me firmly. But I had already made my decision. After 2 days of ignoring calls and messages, I couldn't keep avoiding this. It was time to put an end to it all. When Aunt Jody opened the door, my stepmother stormed in, furious. Sandy stayed by the door, hesitant, as if unsure whether to join the scene or simply observe it like a play. But I knew in my heart that this really was the end. My stepmother held up a stack of papers and in a loud voice declared, "I've calculated all the expenses since you turned 18. Rent, utilities, food. You owe us $30,000. Hearing that, I laughed. But it wasn't a happy laugh. The humor I felt was a mix of sadness and disappointment. "You're giving me a bill. Accusing me of being ungrateful just for existing?" My voice trembled, but my eyes remained locked on my stepmother's. "You stole 50,000 pesos from me, and now you're telling me that I owe you something?" I said. As I uttered those words, the room seemed to shift around me. My stepmother's face reddened as she yelled, "We were making an investment in your future because you had more potential." At that moment, the anger I'd been holding back exploded. Don't you dare decide from the beginning that I wasn't worth investing in," I shouted. I needed a family that believed in me just once. A family that gave me a chance. I looked at my stepmother coldly. The supposed investment robbed me of my life. I reached into my purse and calmly pulled out my father's letter, unfolding it carefully. "When you lied about this," I said, holding up the letter, "it was your investment." I stared pointedly at my stepmother, and then turned to Sandy. "You used my rent money to fund your education. Did you ever stop to think about how much I sacrificed so you could pursue your dreams? Or were you too busy looking down at me from your pedestal?" My words brought an icy silence to the room. I looked at both of them clearly for the first time. My stepmother's desperate need for control, Sandy's arrogant sense of superiority. It all came into sharp focus. "I'm leaving," I said, breathing deeply, and calmly added, "I already signed a lease and enrolled in night classes for next semester." My stepmother's voice rose sharply. "You can't do that." I stood my ground and replied quietly, "I can. Dad believed in me." "Fine then. Go. But don't think even for a second that you'll be better off," my stepmother said coldly. I looked at her silently, feeling something settle within me. Then I replied softly, "It's okay. I don't want anything to do with you either." I turned and started walking across the wooden floors of Jody's house. With each step I took, I felt I was leaving behind everything I thought I needed and moving toward the life I was meant to have. Moving day arrived with a heavy winter rain. With the money I'd saved from my diner shifts, I managed to withdraw what I needed before my stepmother froze my bank account. But since she'd reported my car as stolen, I'd had to leave it behind. Standing in the empty room of my new apartment, looking at the few boxes I had packed, I felt like I had lost everything. But at the same time, I had believed in myself enough to take that first step toward the freedom and the future I had ahead of me. My phone vibrated with a text from Sandy's mom. "In the hospital. Had a panic attack from stress. Hope you're happy." I deleted the message without replying. But my hands trembled as I opened a box filled with kitchen supplies. A rising sense of unease spread through my chest. The diner had cut everyone's hours, and the first tuition payment was approaching, as my night classes were starting in 2 weeks. The cramped apartment walls felt like they were closing in on me, making it hard to breathe. Just then, a sudden knock at the door made me flinch. When I opened the door, Sandy was standing there. I saw her and realized how much she had grown. "Mom's sick," she said without greeting, and then in a grave voice added, "We might lose the house." She explained that the bank had pushed them into taking a second mortgage. Meanwhile, Sandy said she would have to quit her master's degree. The shock made me grip the doorframe to keep myself from falling. "It's not my fault," I said, almost without thinking. Sandy pulled out her phone and showed me a picture of my stepmother in a hospital bed. "Dad would be ashamed of you for doing this to Mom," she said. Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. "Don't you dare use Dad against me," I yelled. "Dad wanted us to be together. But you ruined everything." My voice cracked as I finally managed to get the words out. When you stole my future." Sandy flinched. Her head bowed sadly. "Mom gave her future to someone who could use it better," she said. "You know we were right." At that moment, as she said those words, I slammed the door shut. But her words continued to echo in my head. The small apartment felt like a prison. The sound of the rain hitting the window reminded me of all I had lost. My savings would barely cover next month's rent, and the course catalog for my night classes seemed to mock me from the kitchen counter. At 2:47 a.m., the microwave clock blinked, and my phone lit up again. Sandy had posted a picture of my stepmother in the hospital on social media. The caption read, "Some people choose revenge over family. Please pray for Mom." The comments from family and friends started pouring in, all condemning me. My Amable had written, "How could you do this?" I curled up on the mattress, clutching my father's letter to my chest. I wondered if I'd been wrong. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been selfish. Maybe I never deserved anything more than the future they decided for me. As the rain continued to beat against the window, I found myself wondering why I ever thought I could escape. Exactly 1 month after I left home, I received a certified letter with the official letterhead of the law firm Smith & Associates. At first, I hesitated to open it, thinking it was another tactic from my stepmother to bring me back home. But when I read the contents, I was left in shock. "Dear Ms. Smith, as trustee of the estate of Elijah Smith, it is my duty to deliver this letter following the affirmation of your independent residency." My hands trembled as I continued reading. There was another account my father had set aside, separate from the college fund. It included real estate and stock investments. It was more than enough to ensure that I could live on my own and follow my own life. My father had prepared everything to help me forge my own path. Less than 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door. It was my stepmother. "I heard about the inheritance," she said, pushing past me to enter the apartment. Sandy followed behind, and together they surrounded me, forming their usual wall of accusations. "What is all of this about?" Sandy asked, her voice haughty. My stepmother added coldly, "It's not just a courtesy but a warning. Considering your recent behavior in submitting an application to become your guardian, you're clearly unfit to manage this amount of money on your own behalf." At that moment, as I heard those words, the room spun. "You have no right to do that," I yelled. "I have every right, and I have every intention of doing so," my stepmother replied, pulling out a folder. Inside the folder were records of my supposedly unstable mental state. There were behavioral statements from family and friends, and even medical records. She pushed the folder at me, and I started going through the carefully selected evidence. "You've been planning this ever since you found out about the first letter," I said. "We're trying to protect you," my stepmother said calmly. But at that moment, everything about the pattern that had defined my life became crystal clear. Protecting me meant forcing me back into a life where I worked myself to the bone, funding Sandy's dreams while my own withered and died, believing I wasn't worth investing in, a decision made for me without asking my permission. Now it was clear. My stepmother would never stop trying to crush my dreams. Holding my father's letter firmly, I stood my ground. "If you don't leave, I'm calling the police and taking these documents to a real lawyer to show that you are trying to control me again." My stepmother's face twisted with frustration, but she slowly turned toward the door. Sandy threw one final comment over her shoulder. "You'll regret this decision, Emily." As they walked toward the exit, I thought of my dad, his careful plans, and the faith he had in me. For the first time in my life, I had said no. 1 year later, I was in the university library, surrounded by textbooks and the soft hum of students preparing for final exams when a message from Aunt Jody appeared on my phone. It read, "Check the letter. I was cleaning your dad's house in his old desk. I found an unfinished letter he wrote a few days before he died. Unlike the other letters, this one abruptly cut off mid-sentence. What caught my attention was a book next to the letter. Dad's worn copy of Jane Eyre. He promised to give it to you. If you want it, it's yours." That night, I received the book from Jody. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, a small envelope fell out. Inside was a picture I'd never seen before. It was a picture of my dad in his youth, proudly holding the key to his first apartment. On the back of the photo, he had written, "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. Now it's your turn." I thought about Sandy. She had quit her master's program the week before and had started working as a waitress. She had sent me a single text message. "Now I understand." I didn't reply, but I understood what she meant by those words. The two of them had sold the house and moved out of their big, familiar home to a small apartment. Their new place was a single unit in an old building, with a combined kitchen and living room. My stepmother had started working part-time at a local small supermarket where she could now be seen as a cashier. This was her first job in 20 years, and it was a far cry from her previously elegant demeanor. Their lives had completely changed, forcing them to face the consequences of the decisions they had made. This realization brought me a strange sense of relief, as I thought that maybe, just maybe, this transformation would have taught them something. I had worked with the lawyer my dad introduced me to and successfully recovered the inheritance my stepmother had squandered. I also got a restraining order against her to ensure I wouldn't have to deal with her anymore. As I scanned the words of my dad's letter, a thought struck me. My stepmother always believed that if faced with hardships, I would crumble, eventually being rebuilt as she desired. But I hadn't followed her expectations. Instead, I had charted my own path. My first semester grades were proof that my dad had seen my potential all along. In my new environment, I found people who valued me for who I was. The book club I had started at the local coffee shop had grown far beyond a simple pastime. The group had become a close-knit circle of friends who accepted and supported me, not for what I could offer, but for who I am. Next month, we would be discussing Jane Eyre at my suggestion, and I had something more to look forward to. Just then my phone vibrated. "Would you like to continue working on the story? Or do you need help with something else?" My phone vibrated again. A message from Sandy appeared on the screen. "Can we talk?" It was a short sentence, but her emotions were clearly conveyed. I picked up the photo of my dad and looked at his proud smile once more. That smile gave me a newfound sense of certainty. Revenge wasn't about hurting someone. It was about saving yourself. It was also about stopping living someone else's story and starting to live your own. I sent a reply to Sandy. "Tuesday, 2 p.m., M Street Coffee Shop." This could be a step forward. Maybe Sandy was ready to start her own story. Or maybe not. Either way, it didn't matter. Now I held the key to my own life, and a smile I could be proud of. And I had a new chapter to write.